measurements of sustainability, sustainable production, sustainable innovation. You can put sustainability in front of almost any word you can think of and make sense of it today. The next session is going to be on growth, economic growth, which is on everybody's lips, from politicians, teachers, bus drivers, and yeah, probably all of us in here. It dominates the political discourse from the local to the global level. We need economic growth to clean plastic from the oceans. We need economic growth to ensure that the smallest villages still have jobs to offer to the next generation. We need economic growth to provide for the world's poor, and we need economic growth for the future generation that precedes us. Sometimes it's argued despite, and sometimes it's because of the ecological chaos that we are currently creating. Economic growth is definitely a buzzword, and economists, that is no surprise, obsess about it. It's not, however, equally popular in all strands of economics. While the classical economists like Smith and Ricardo talked a lot about growth, they thought about growth as something that was naturally constrained. Now, with Solow's growth model in the 60s, this constraint was removed or disappeared from the minds of economists in the natural sense, and the only constraint that exists on economic growth then was technology. And to a large extent, that is still what exists in the mainstream strands of economics. Environmental economics then appeared in the 70s as quite a marginal strand of the mainstream of economics, and built on the solo growth model, of which Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize last year, is a good example. This kind of economic thinking on nature has no limit to growth. But what is interesting is that at the same time as Nordhaus started modeling his climate economy models, Limits to Growth was published. And so there is a separate discourse that exists and is still very present today on how nature does constrain or limit growth. Today we see a renewed interest in degrowth and planetary boundaries, and so this session will try to discuss the differences between these paradigms or discourses or worlds or whatever you want to call it. And we will try to discuss the problem or the question, is growth possible within the planet's carrying capacity? With us today, to try to answer this question, and we'll see how far we get, we have Max Koch, who is a sociologist and professor at Lund University, where he works on political economy, social welfare regimes, ecological sustainability, and regulation theory. We also have Tone Smith, who is an ecological economist educated in Vienna, where she also engages in the city's growth critical circles of researchers. And then last we have Per Espen Stoknes, who is an associate professor at BI, the Norwegian Business School, where he heads the Center for Green Growth. Educated as both an economist and a psychologist, Per Espen has worked with a variety of topics related to sustainability. My name is Marie, and I'm a member of Rethinking Economics Norway, and I will guide these brilliant speakers through this session. First, we're going to have 15 minutes from each of them. Then we're going to gather the forces down at this table and have a round of questions, and you guys will also get to ask the questions you would like. So then first, Max, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me to your event here on rethinking sustainability, which of course is a key event. So And Tone asked me to talk about a bit about institutional economics and about the role of the state. Well, so I will try to do that, but I will also try to embed that in a degrowth background. Well, these are the three things I'm talking about. Well, let me just first try to explain with this data why I kind of ended in this camp that some, I think quite a few economists would qualify as a lunatic camp. Basically, the D word is probably not something that makes big careers within economic these days. But the data are, I think, quite harsh, to be honest. Well, we've heard yesterday before the film about Margaret Thatcher, who kind of launched a kind of degrowth by disaster in the 1980s. So what the various degrowthers in various countries have in mind is something else. That would be something like degrowth by design. And just let me briefly show you why I think that something like that is actually necessary. We don't have to call it that way, but we can probably agree on that climate change, among other environmental threats, is a global issue, because for the atmosphere it doesn't matter from what point in the world carbon emissions are emitted. And we have in one paper, Martin Fritz is a sociologist from Bielefeld I have worked with quite a bit. We have kind of divided 144 countries of the world, which is almost a global perspective. There are almost 200 countries, but you don't have data for all of them. We divided them basically by GDP per capita, and we did that more or less the same kind of sample size, a bit more than 30 each. And then we looked at ecological, social, and individual life indicators. So let me introduce this very briefly. So you can basically see that you have here, which we called that the poor countries, the developing, the emerging, the rich, and the what we call overdeveloped countries. These were really statistical outliers because there, on average, people earn a lot more than anywhere else, and I have to say Norway is among them. So when you roughly summarize this, you see that social inclusion indicators, including the Gini index and the homicide rates and also the democracy index, and also quality of life indicators, including life expectancy and subjective well-being, they all go up, and they largely develop in parallel with GDP per capita. So the richer a country is, the safer it is to live there, the longer people live, and also the happier people are. So that is, of course, good news, but if you look at the left corner of the left column, the ecological sustainability indicators, you see that they, let's call them unsustainability indicators, including CO2 emissions, ecological footprint of production and consumption, they also go up. The richer the countries are, the happier they are, but also the dirtier they are. We have looked into that more, and basically the only group of countries that could currently be qualified as being within planetary limits are the poorest ones. So you can imagine what kind of step a country like Norway would have to initiate to kind of embed its production and consumption limits into planetary limits. So and to be absolutely sure, I am not against green growth or anything. I just think it's not enough, and green growth measures will have to turn into something that could be degrowth measures as soon as possible. Right. So having said that, I am within the degrowth research community probably one who keeps emphasizing that such a move is far from a walk in the park. at the moment, a range of institutions, you see on the right-hand side, the political system, the welfare state, media, education, you name it, they are all coupled to the, to growth. And changing that requires not only a change in one of these systems, but more or less a parallel change in a range of social systems that would also need to happen more or less at the same speed. So if it has not the same speed, roughly the same speed, and if it happens only in certain social subsystems, then you are likely to get what classical sociologists such as Durkheim described as anomie, where particular subsystems of the society are not well connected to each other, and the same goes for the norms and values that people acquire during their socialization. That means they could be, so to speak, out of touch with the institutional structure of society. So the choice we have is not a really comfortable one. One I think is highly unlikely that we will gain green growth at the extent that we would gain an absolute decoupling of GDP growth, resource use and carbon emission of the extent that climate scientists see as necessary. The IPCC says we have 12 years left for significant changes in the whole societal setup, and I must say this is very difficult to see with economic growth at the same time. On the other hand, we have a huge challenge ahead in basically redesigning a whole set of social structures and institutions so that they can function without growth. I also have to say that I have worked on this a lot with my colleague from Leeds, Milena Büchs. We could not come up with any democratic example where a change of that order had taken place. Maybe you have one, so it would need to happen for the first time. And the only thing I can say to that is that it is important to create spaces where we actually can learn to interact with each other, can learn to design first at lower scales, basically in institutions that work in other ways than dependent on the growth imperative. And of course, the degrowth conferences that we organize are part of that. Now I want to say something about economics too. And I have to say, judging by what I've heard this morning, that economics doesn't seem in the best of all conditions here, if it is largely reduced to neoclassical thought. And even if people like me gets invited to economics conferences, because I'm a sociologist, well, much of what we could discuss later on is probably about the contradiction of ecological economics on the other and neoclassical economics on the other one. So one emphasizes matter and energy flows, and the other emphasizes monetary flows. And in my work on political economy, specifically, in relation to climate change, I have tried to bring the two together and ended up with Karl Marx, a kind of pivot and that is basically the double character of work and the commodity, which he says is the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns. So I was very pleased to see so many Marx quotes yesterday in the film, and feel a bit justified. So you have the exchange value moment of commodity and work, which reduces concrete works and matter energy to repositories of abstract labor, that regards land, raw materials, fuels as free gifts from nature and sources of rents, and it tends towards an infinite expansion of scale to produce more extract exchange value and capital. And then you have, on the other hand, the use value element of the commodity and work, which is itself bound up with rearranging matter and energy. The expansion of scale translate into increasing throughput of raw materials and auxiliaries, and that throughput has to go down. It has to go down significantly if we want to meet the climate targets that we have given ourselves. And that is accompanied by a degradation of the environment and an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. I have pointed it out, and I cannot kind of go in the detail. The strong side in Marx's analysis is to always look at three things at the same time. That is not only economic categories like commodity, money, wage labor, etc., but it is also accompanying social relations. Some of them are based on equality and equality, and others are based on inequality and exploitation. And it also looks, while rising from the abstract to the concrete, to corresponding modes of consciousness. And the crux of the matter is, if you go right through all these categories of the 3 volumes of Capital, you also have an idea why the growth imperative comes across as the natural way of running the show, the only possible way of actually doing economics, which is obviously not true if you think historically about it. How much time do I have left?
So much.
5 minutes? Yeah, 5 minutes. Okay, I just say something about the. Of course, what you can take from Marx is kind of the insight that there are structural tensions between the exchange value element of production and the ecological part of it. There are also social tensions which we cannot really talk about. And one institutional school of economics that I have often applied in my work over the years is that of the regulation approach, associated with names like Aglietta, Boyer, many others. And that highlights that social and environmental tensions that would correspond to the mode of production manifest themselves differently in historical growth periods and according to national and other institutional particulars. That means it is always about balancing production and consumption norms in regulation theory, but that is done differently, historical and also across space if you look at different countries. Then there are certain core concepts which could be mentioned. Accumulation regimes and modes of regulations are linked to patterns of societalization and energy regimes, such as fossil and solar energy regimes, but also to institutional forms. And institutional forms kind of give us an idea how to comparatively analyze employment systems, finance systems, and a lot of other things. They include the wage relation, the nature of money, international regulation, and the role of the state. And what I have in mind now is basically to use this analysis of institutional forms, which were originally designed for growth strategies, to basically formulate a kind of a political economy of the post-growth era. 1 minute, two, right. And I have to make that very short now. I just look at, we've heard before in the session about the money system, which we've seen can be done in a lot of other things, but I'm not very good at money, to have to say. But another institutional system is the state, which is prominent in regulation theory. And you could basically look at certain things. You could look at 3 main categories. The role of the state in economic development, first here in a capitalist growth economy, then state spatiality, that means the kind of spatial level where states are primarily active, and you can look at economic, social, and environmental policies. Well, I won't go through this in the detail now, But my working hypothesis is that the existing state apparatus can be used to actually initiate a transition towards an economy that is not anymore exchange value dominated, but use value oriented. That means, as ecological economists would have it, seen primarily as a biophysical process. That would have repercussions for the spatial target, where states are primarily active on. That would be a new kind of division of labor between global and local levels. At the global level, threshold for matter and energy throughput would need to be determined and identified, and these would delineate the leeway within which national and local economies could evolve. And then you can discuss a range of what we call eco-social policies that might actually help basically the transition process getting underway, including, for example, minimum and maximum incomes and consumption-oriented policies. 30 seconds for my very temporarily conclusion. To my best assessment, something like degrowth is necessary in the rich countries. That is due to the very weak evidence for an absolute decoupling of GDP growth, resource use, and carbon emissions. But it is, and that is, I am the first to admit that, and I want actually to initiate more discussion on that, very difficult to achieve. On the economic side, because we are on an economics conference, I would say that a rediscovery of Marx in combination with institutional approaches such as regulation theory may facilitate an integration of standard and ecological economics and the formulation of a political economy of the post-growth era. And third, the existing state apparatus may be used to initiate a social and ecological transition and to launch corresponding eco-social policies. Many thanks.
Make it a warm up. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. So I will, in this presentation, as Marie said, I'm an ecological economist, and I want to bring the ecological economics perspective to the debate and try to give some views on these two questions. Is sustainable growth possible, and is economic growth desirable? And I really want to do this from a broad perspective, because I think sometimes we lose this the main overview, which is really key here, especially from the discipline I come from. First, I just want to recall the historical discourse about the economic growth and the environment, because it already came up this morning in the presentation of environmental economics. What is here on the slide, the kind of debate from the 1960s and 70s, where the general perception was that economic growth is incompatible with environmental protection. And in those days, this was quite the broad view, which was very much debated and was central in the first United Nations Summit on the Environment and Development in Stockholm in '72. But then this kind of faded away. In environmental economists today, we challenge this, that this would also say it's too negative to think that economic growth and the environment environmental protection are incompatible. And this was part of then a discourse I would link very much to neoliberalism, which started in the 80s. And in particular, I think the Brundtland report is interesting in this respect because it pointed out that what we need to solve environmental problems is economic growth. So the argument was completely turned around. And this was then meant to happen in terms of changing the content of growth. So how do we change the content of growth? So there's been two main ways of looking at this. One is that we would change the structure in the economy, and this would supposedly help us to produce growth with less environmental impact. So change the structure means mainly to move from production to service sector. And the other strategy is resource efficiency and decoupling. And this is core to what we've heard many times today. Resource efficiency is core to environmental economic strategies. Decoupling is really a keyword that comes up again and again. In the former session, we learned about the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is exactly one of the goals. So this is the way that we will try to address environmental impact. But the question then, because this has been what's been upheld, this is the way we should go about. It's been said this now for 40 years or so, yeah? 45 years. So the question is, did it happen? And Max has already talked about this, so I shouldn't show too many figures, but it's also important to underpin the argument a bit with numbers. These numbers are from were published in 2016 from Ward and colleagues, and they show GDP, energy use, and material use for different countries or regions: China, Germany, OECD, and the world in total. And typically, what is often pointed out is that as long as GDP grows more than the environmental footprint or degradation or pressure, this is then relative decoupling. This is efficiency increase, so this is going the right way. And in 2016, the International Energy Agency declared that we had now achieved absolute decoupling because we had, for 2 years, 2014 and 15, managed to stop the energy-related CO2 emissions. And this was like, it should kind of be the crowning of this attempt to not only have relative decoupling, but actually actual absolute decoupling. Now, the thing is that we live in a growth society. So sometimes there's lots of debate about the details in these numbers, but if we take a step back and look at the scale of this, then it is really the exponential growth in population, in GDP, in primary energy production, in water consumption, in telecommunication infrastructure. I mean, this is the material background of our economy. And this is made possible, and this is very important from an ecological economics perspective, that our society is built on a cheap supply of fossil fuels, and this is what has made everything possible. Not that we have increased our labor productivity so amazingly, but it's because we have had energy, cheap energy, which could replace our energy, our work, labor. And this is the fundamental problem that we need to address here. And this means that the extent of decoupling, if we want to continue to talk about that, is massive. So these numbers are produced by Tim Jackson, who was presented in the movie yesterday. They're a bit old, 2007, but again, look at the scale of the things. So we actually need to decouple from the three pillars on the left are the situation in 2007, and the ones on the right are different scenarios based on how things can evolve. But, you know, whether we choose scenario 1, 2, 3, or 4, we really need to decrease our carbon intensity, which means the use of carbon per produced dollar or a money measure enormously. Another maybe simpler way to perceive this is that to reach the 2-degree targets, rich countries need to reduce carbon emissions by 15% every year. And this is much more than just managing to level out a little bit in 1 year or two the energy consumption. or emissions. So really, the discussion about decoupling and resource efficiency is a sidetrack, because what we need is to reduce the environmental pressures. And there is no absolute decoupling in sight, even though if we look at some detailed number, we could find something maybe using a specific measure. But overall, this is really, I think, it takes a lot of attention and lots of researchers calculating numbers when really we need to do something of a completely different scale. But okay, just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it cannot happen, yeah? Because history is always different from what was before. But then I think we need to look at the arguments that should convince us that it can happen then. And then I think we must turn to theory, and where I will use some ecological economics arguments here. So, why has decoupling not happened? Well, one argument for that it would happen was that we will have a change from service sector to from production sector to service sector, and that this was meant to change the environmental pressure. Well, it turns out that this structural change didn't happen to the extent, even though, you know, countries like the UK closed down their coal industry and so on, and of course, and built up the London city finance sector instead. This helps, of course, at the national numbers. But we don't consume less in material terms. So overall, on a global level, our consumption is not decreasing. And this is because we can also call this an offshoring or our consumption, or it's also called imported footprint. There are many ways to explain this, but even though we might manage some structural change of our economies at home, it doesn't really affect the material uses of our consumption and in the rich world. And the other thing is maybe to discuss about moving from production to service sector has also proven not to necessarily lead to less emissions, because, for example, the transport sector is part of the service sector, as we know, is not a very environmentally friendly sector to increase. Another argument is what's called the Jevons paradox, or the rebound effect, which is that there is a tendency that when we have resource efficiency, we actually use more resources. And this can be illustrated in the following way, that today we have a certain amount of products which use a certain amount of energy. So the energy or materials illustrated by the light blue area. Then we have product invasion, so that we can produce the 6 red same items with less material input or output. But then the effect is just that we produce more and use more anyway. And cars, I think, is the most easy example here. We have more energy efficient cars, but we drive more. So it just eats up all the efficiency. Now, this could maybe be countered by having some limits or ceilings on, you know, what we allow ourselves as society to use as resources, but we don't do that. Because we shouldn't limit ourselves, we mustn't forbid things and regulate in this way. So we always count on resource efficiency, and then this is what's happening. And the fourth argument, which is the most ecological economics argument here, is that the real economy is actually a material economy, it turns out, because as we see all the time, GDP growth and energy flows are very closely connected, and it's hard to break this. And just to explain a little bit more than how we perceive this economy, which one can call it the biophysical economy, which is different from the money economy, is that all production processes requires resource input and produces waste. And this means that one cannot just talk about internalizing externalities as a way to solve this, because pollution is all pervasive in the economy, because everything we do has a waste side to it. And this is something we must realize and not just try to put under the carpet, which also means that there is no such thing as clean energy. So to call renewable energy clean is in this respect misleading. And I think we can see it already with the attempts to shift to renewable energy, that it creates lots of environmental conflicts around the world related to extraction or to building of the infrastructure for windmills. Also in Norway, this is not only a third world or problem, even though the environmental conflicts are maybe even harsher there. So the consequence is also that if the economy is material, then actually the scale of the economy matters, and we cannot just only talk about relative numbers, which is what this relative decoupling does. And also what mainstream economy does. Mainstream economics does not relate to the fact that there are absolute scales. It's all relative all the time. And this is just a kind of a slight different version of the one that Ove Jacobsen showed this morning, but it illustrates that we must think about the economy as being embedded in the biophysical reality, and the biophysical reality cannot grow, so only the economy can grow, and then to a certain limit, because it's bound by its outer limit. Okay, so given all this, then come to the second question, whether economic growth is desirable, or I can also pose it, is it a problem then that we cannot have eternal economic growth, which is obviously the conclusion from my first part here. Well, I think the interesting thing is that even before one started to discuss environmental problems related to the economic growth, there was actually a discussion about social limits to growth. So this contradiction between growth and the environment is not only the only problem area. It has been already on the table that economic growth also has social issues. And Hirsch published in 1960s the book called The Social Limits to Growth, where exactly he points out that there are certain things in society which will not be solved by more growth, because we have a hierarchical social structure, so that only some people are meant to have certain things. So the day everybody can afford a Mercedes-Benz, then it's not any longer, it doesn't have the symbolic meaning it was meant to. And the people who are in higher income levels of the society will do something else instead to manifest the position that they are holding. And this was parts of the same things were already discussed by Veblen already 100 years ago about the conspicuous consumption or luxury consumption of the ruling classes. And Easterlin even more illustrated this by showing with statistics that over a certain level of GDP, in absolute terms, people tend not to become any more happy or satisfied with the increasing material wealth. And more recent kind of arguments then is related to that this growth economy is stressful, it's a lot of performance pressure, competition, and depression and alienation related to this kind of economic system. Okay, and then I just want to deconstruct a few myths here about growth, because one is that we need growth to have more jobs. But actually, growth, if you look at it over the long term, growth does not lead to more jobs in terms of hours worked. In the West, it has not done that in a long-term perspective. So it's true that when we have a recession, unemployment rises, but it is not true that over the long run, we have more jobs because of growth. And another myth is relates to that growth lifts millions out of poverty. I think it was interesting in the debate about a panel on GDP in the former session. Exactly this, setting the poverty level at now $1.92, I think, is the poverty level. So once people move from one statistical category to the next, we have increased, we have reduced poverty and lifted millions out of poverty. But this also actually is a change for many people from a completely different life, where they often live in self-sufficient lives with some access to land, with a community around them that can help each other, to, as it has happened in China, where people have been involuntarily moved from the countryside into the city to build up industry. It is, okay. Is it really an increase in, an increase in living standard to be moved out of self-sufficiency into living in a dirty city where you have to work with bad living conditions And you also need money to pay your food and your lodging. Yeah, and finally, growth often gets attributed things which are not a direct connection, like education and health and so on. Okay, conclusion. So, if there is no decoupling and no reason theoretically to believe it will happen, and growth does not address basic needs directly anyway, and they lead to it leads to environmental problems and social challenges at least, then why is the lack of growth a problem? Well, I think the recurring argument is really that our economy depends upon growth, and we need to avoid crisis and recession because this is really the scary thing. But this is not really satisfactory. I mean, if growth leads to problems and our economy depends upon growth, then the conclusion should be we have a problem. And here I just want to cite Mariana Matsukata because she is quite a popular speaker on the kind of a little bit left-wing people. And I think she draws the completely wrong conclusion. So she was asked in a talk she gave in Vienna, you know, should we not reduce growth because it has environmental problems? And she says, it's not a question about growth or no growth. We must have growth because if not, we will have unemployment. And this again then links to the things that Max was mentioning, that, I mean, employment at all costs. Is this really what we want to do? We should talk about decent work, meaningful work, maybe even basic income without work, and discuss a completely different kind of system. So the main question should rather be what to do to set up a society where everybody can live a good life, and what kind of economy would it imply to be able to create such a society? This is, of course, a big question, but we are here to discuss. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, hello everybody. Actually, it's wonderful being back here. It's exactly 31 years ago once I was first joining this faculty and sitting as a student up there watching lectures down here. So it's kind of strange for me being back in this room where I spent so much of my time. So having said that, together with Jürgen Randers, where are you? There you are. We have to stand here, right? Oh yeah, sorry. Oh, okay, boring. We run something called the Center for Green Growth, and our latest publication, which I didn't have time to put in there, is called Transformation is Feasible, which looks at all these questions. How do we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals within planetary boundaries? And we discuss different types of growth, different growth models, to see how far one or the other can bring us. But I also want to mention that I've recently spent quite a lot of time as a politician with the Green Party in Parliament because our party leader was a maternity leave. And being the sole representative among 169 parliamentarians coming from a party who is deeply growth critical is quite, shall we say, cooling experience. So, however much I love Tuna's points and her integrity and your power of your speech, I look forward to the day when you convince the 168 others of your perspective. I have a PhD in green economics from this faculty, but I was originally educated as a psychologist, which tend to bring me to the issue of growth from sometimes a different format than many others. Because I always look at how do people think, and how can we communicate this? How do people feel about it? So what is the feeling of growth, and what is the feeling of degrowth, if you want to sell that? Currently writing a book on this topic, tentatively called Healthy Growth, a therapy for our economic mind, to address the addiction we have to certain types of growth thinking. Enough about that myself. One problem I want to raise here, which I think has been under-communicated within this field, is the extent of wastefulness in our economy. We have designed incredibly wasteful economic systems in terms of material throughput. Let me show you a couple of examples. If you want to light a room somewhere, most places in the world, they use coal, and they use incandescent light bulb and to provide a light that is needed. What we want is light. We don't want to have that coal. Now, can this be done differently? Absolutely. They use 100 kilowatt hours of chemical coal energy to give people a year for one light. Give the people light for 1 year. That's an efficiency of 1%. So 99% wastefulness is wasted through that economic system, or that material throughput. The same thing is the case for buildings in general. These kind of buildings, we make a lot of them. We fire them up with fossil fuels. We use them very rarely. 60% of the time they're empty. Over 70% of the materials are thrown away after one use. And even 20% of the materials is lost while constructing them. If we look at cars and our mobility system, this shows if you put 60 liters of diesel on your SUV and try to run it, well, a lot of that is idling. This is heating the air. This is transmission losses, auxiliary power losses, rolling resistance, aerodynamic losses. This goes to moving, accelerating steel. And that is what moves you around. So if you want to go from A to B with this kind of amazing technology, you pour away, if you have 60 liters, you pour away 59.4 liters on the ground, or you do heat the air with it, and you use 0.6. 99% wastefulness in a lot of mobility. The same thing with and building services. Thirdly, food. This is a Sankey diagram showing the petacalories going into corn, soybean, other crops. This is hay, grass silage. This is corn. This is pasture. As you can see, this is pure losses. More than 93% of that input is pure loss, and only 7% reaches the human. If you feed people beef, it's only 3% of the feed, or 3%. Which means that the food system we have created is incredibly wasteful. And as Johan Rockström showed on the Eat Lancet report, giving people a healthy, sustainable diet is enough to fix climate change by 2050. So, the important variable is no longer labor productivity. For 200 years, the conventional economy, and this is the explanation behind a lot of your numbers, have been maximizing labor productivity. How can we have less people doing more stuff? And we've poured lots of fossil energy into that to make that happen. Now, the next 50 years, and this is the reason why I think green growth and sustainable growth is possible, is that we can innovate these incredibly wasteful systems so they're not so wasteful. Just a factor 4 or factor 5 improvement is sufficient. So what we need to follow is resource productivity, which is value creation divided by resource use. And resource use, you can typically measure either by emissions, by domestic material consumptions from mass flow accounting, or from the ecological footprint measured in global hectares per year. So, sorry for showing you this slide so abruptly, but let me walk you through it. This is a map of growth. So what we have here, if you start in origo, is economic growth up the axis. If there is economic growth in an entity, such as a country, 10% per year, you're up here. If you have degrowth, you go down here this way. This axis is the ecological footprint, change from year to year, 10% minus, 10% plus. Now, if we continue with using more resources in the same tempo as we have with economic growth, we are on this line, because here the GDP change is the same as the ecological footprint change. This is what we call grey growth. Let me be very clear here. Grey growth is impossible to continue in the long run. It's a recipe for disaster. So we have to be very critical of what kind of growth model we have. Down here, we have a case where we have dirty degrowth. That's a situation where the GDP goes down, but the ecological footprint increases. How can that be possible? Well, we have a couple of countries around today doing that. Venezuela is one. We have a degrowth also in Syria, and we could also look at Japan, for instance, after 2011, when they closed down their nuclear reactors. GDP went down, but they used more coal, so they ended up in this quadrant as well. So that's one kind of degrowth. Another kind of degrowth is when GDP goes down, but the ecological footprint goes down as well. But if you're just here, let's say you do take down the 5% GDP and then only 1% ecological footprint. This is not enough to solve the problem. So you have to have a quicker reduction in ecological footprint than their decline in economic growth. That's why this corner up here, and sorry for the PowerPoint to do strange things to my keynote slides. This is the genuine green growth area, where you can have at least 5% per year improvement in the resource productivity, which means that if all countries do that, then we have a chance, at least, to reach the 2-degree target from the Paris Agreement. And I disagree with the 15% number. We can discuss that if you want. 5% puts us on the track. Now, rich countries often want to have more growth. They want to go up here. But maybe they more belong down here, as we say. So this is the relative case for degrowth. Why should we maximize growth if we can have a moderate growth? So 4 to 5% annual growth would probably bring us to the type of footprint increases, but a 1 to 2% annual growth combined with a rapid decline in ecological footprint brings us into the genuine green growth area. And poor countries might need more than 5% for a while to actually get on track and bring enough growth and enough education, enough health services to their people. And in that case, they should be allowed to increase their footprint somewhat, particularly if they have higher than 5% growth. And then the interesting thing is that as countries get richer, the GDP growth rate tends to decline. So a lot of research Jürgen and myself have done shows that on average, richer countries, as they cross $30,000 and $40,000 per head or per capita of GDP growth, their growth rate declines naturally. Where are we time-wise? Yes. So, yeah, 5 more minutes. Thanks. So now we have a map. My question to Max and Tone would be, where would you want to be on this map? Is it down here? Or how, if we do that, how will we guarantee that we don't end up in an insufficiently green degrowth? So we can have degrowth, and then a lot of people get unemployed and investments go down, and existing industries dig their feet in, and they stop investing in new technologies or systems that have a higher resource productivity. So my recommendation would be to have a moderate economic growth combined with a rapid decline in ecological footprint for rich countries. Now, we just note green growth is not enough by itself. We need to see it in a context of what we could call inclusive wealth. And here I'm building on people like Partha Dasgupta and his work on genuine savings, or rather inclusive wealth. So as we have flows that increase, we get economic growth. If we have green growth, that's a kind of economic growth where the ecological footprint goes down. And then we need a sustainable growth, which is a green growth that is more inclusive. if we have these kinds of flows every year, we will build a broad, balanced set of assets, a more productive economy, that is a green economy, which fits within the planetary boundaries, the economics, the ecosystem, and then finally a sustainable economy, which is a green economy that is inclusive. So you bring down the inequality, and you increase the human and social capital in it. That's why we need to focus on this, and this is why I think green growth is a very important narrative, that we come together and show this is the kind of change we want. Every year we need to meet these criteria. And secondly, we need to build a more sustainable growth where we bring down the inequality. So, sorry again, PowerPoint is changing around my slides. This is GDP per person. So now we have a three-dimensional system where we have equality or inequality along the axis. And Jürgen and myself, we prefer speaking about inequality in terms of the Palma ratio. The Palma ratio is the 10% richest divided by the 40% poorest. The income of the 10% richest divided by the income of the 40% richest. Because it's more sensitive and more easy to understand than the Gini coefficient. So now we have three dimensions of growth or change, and now we can measure what we're doing. What's the GDP growth or degrowth? What's the ecological footprint change year by year for any economic entity, from a company to a city to a sector to a country to the world? And we can start to put countries and companies into this space. And I did make a kind of boxy figure here to show you now we have 8 types of growth, really. Or 4 types of growth or 4 types of degrowth. We have the fair green degrowth down here, which brings down the Palma ratio. Here you have unfair green degrowth, which means that you get green by denying the poor access to the resources, but for instance, throwing them out of the forest or whatever. You can have unfair green growth, and you can have what we call a healthy growth, which is both fair and green. And then you have also the grey and unfair growth, and the grey unfair degrowth corner behind there. Now let me sum up. I agree with believe. Oh, sorry again, this slide. I agree on the long-term goal and vision. Yes, 9 billion people living well, flourishing within planetary boundaries by 2050. Which means inside what Kate Raworth in her brilliant book calls the sweet donut, or what we call sustainable development goals within planetary boundaries. I think we agree that GDP increase is not a goal for a society. It makes no sense to have GDP as a goal. Well-being is, and planetary stewardship is. Both those are worthy goals. Now, the question then is, how do we realize those worthy goals? And we should reduce resource use. And I completely agree, we need a degrowth of material throughput or degrowth of ecological footprint in absolute terms. That includes a massive and rapid scale-up of public, in particular, investments in renewable. Then we need to expand the social commons of education, health, affordable public transportation, etc. And we need more progressive taxation to finance the above. I think there's little disagreement about what I heard so far. But here is where I think we disagree, and I hope where we can discuss. What is the best way to create at least 30% of Norwegian and other countries' population support for these things? Is it by selling degrowth and a recession to ask people to sacrifice their goods? Is that a good strategy? Or by selling credible win-win options that eliminate the resource wastefulness? I think killing wastefulness is an absolute requirement and a very good framing for communication in terms of how, I mean, either if you're right or left, if you're young or old, we don't like wastefulness. And today we have wastefulness, and we can solve that by improving the resource productivity of our economy by more than 5% every year. So that sums up my position. To answer the question then, that is the title of this session, is sustainable growth possible? I want to answer in 3 points. Well, grey growth, or business as usual, is impossible in the long run. Second, green growth is fully possible, and we see empirically demonstrated by countries such as Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Switzerland, Costa Rica, etc. We also see it in companies and other sectors. Thirdly, sustainable growth is needed, because you can't have green growth without this being a more inclusive economy with less income and wealth inequalities. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah. Yes. So Presman already summed up some of the points on which we agree. But let's try to take this down, and then I'm sure it will get very deep and intellectual. And we will take questions, but just bear with me for a second. So when we acknowledge the fact that growth hasn't been correlated with human well-being in the West since around the 1970s, I want to hear quickly from all of you, should we target growth at all? Be that higher growth, lower growth? Why are we talking about growth? Per Espen?
Yes, does it work? Yeah. So, as we said, GDP growth is not a goal in itself. However, when the economy goes into recession, we get a lot of unwanted by-effects, such as increasing unemployment, rapid decline in investment, and people more focusing on the short term, securing their own safety net, fighting for their savings. We also see less, from a psychology point of view, for instance, after in the global financial, the Great Recession, there was much less concern or engagement with climate. Environmental concern went down, and people put the economy and employment on the top of their concerns that politicians should address. So even though I would love to have personally a degrowth combined with a rapid decline in ecological footprint, and the footprint must be even more rapid than the decline in GDP, I don't think this is a viable route for affecting transformation in a society. It's much easier with a 1% moderate growth, stable economy to get the shifts in investments that are required quickly enough.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's good to see that we agree on a few things here. So one of the things about degrowth is not to equalize it with recession. It is part of the critique of GDP that we want other measurements of, if you want, human development, including the matter and energy throughput. But also I put up in my first or second slide, no, there are indicators for social inclusion, there are indicators for, well, individual well-being, and this is something we should be striving for, but matter energy throughput should maybe have priority here. I probably disagree with you in the sense, no, I totally agree with you that green growth is much easier to sell. The advantage of green growth is that you don't make any enemies with it. This may explain why from liberal parties to conservative parties to green parties, from employers' organizations to trade unions, everyone will sign up for it. Now, I am not a politician, but I'm an academic, and just by the fact that a lot of people kind of follow a certain trend that doesn't follow for me to do the same. Having said that, there seems to be at least an increase in people who kind of share our questioning of the growth imperative and our ambition to replace it with other parameters. Our open letter, which was for post-growth and for a well-being pact in the European Union, has by now been cited by 90,000 people in Europe, originally signed by 230 academics, and now, I'm not saying this is an absolute mass movement, but we have to start from somewhere. Mm-hmm.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Trying not to repeat too much what I said. I mean, I think it's reasonable that we care about growth because we live in a specific system which proves problematic when there is recession, and this is exactly the problem. So if we want to deal with the issues related to environmental problems, then we need to change the system, because if not, we have the social issues with unemployment. And but the interesting thing somebody told me yesterday was that a poll in Europe shows that European youth, who are the ones most susceptible to unemployment, I mean, especially in Southern Europe, unemployment rates are huge, are actually very concerned about environmental issues. So there are people who, even if they are in danger of being the one who gets into trouble with this kind of unemployment economy that we have now, are really caring about the environment. So maybe it's not as bad as we think, that, you have to sell this blurry concept of green growth, which, as it was said, it's easy to sell. And if it's easy to sell, then maybe it's because it doesn't really pinpoint what we want to do something about. So we get people on board which doesn't want to change the material and energy throughput of the economy.
Have a comment there?
Quick comment.
So I have a challenge to both of you. And when you say degrowth or when you say post-growth, could you, and it's not the same, you said, as a GDP decline or recession. So could you please quantify then a post-growth society? What is the GDP rate it has?
This is not the way to define it.
Okay.
The basic definition is to deprioritize GDP growth, and to replace it with other parameters, and that's why I cannot quantify it in terms of GDP.
But we have statistics offices that will go on calculating it. And what do you think will be the rate of change from one year to the next when they calculate it? If we implemented a degrowth or a post-growth political system, what would the GDP show? Would they stop measuring it?
If we decide so, they would stop. In the post-growth society, maybe that is the whole point. So if we agree then that economic growth isn't the most important factor for sustainability, talking a little bit about solutions here, how do we organize or ensure in some way that this human economy, or rather, is it... I'm struggling with this question. How do we ensure that the human economy controls its material flow within the planetary boundaries? As short as you can though, what are the institutional changes that are needed?
Oh.
We're talking solutions, no?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Max or Tone?
You go.
So people like to talk solutions, but I come from a little bit different perspective, because I think if one argues for more democracy, it's just as much to discuss how to deal with it, not to present certain solutions. Although this is really what comes up every time one presents some kind of system critique, that one should have the solution. And if one advocates for more democracy, I think it was mentioned earlier today, we cannot be sure that this will solve the environmental crisis, but this is anyway my approach, that I would want to have a more participatory approach to how to to deal with these things. And if we have more bottom-up approaches to solve, like Ove Jacobsen talked about this morning, there seems to be quite a lot of people who really want to engage practically in projects which are more local, so it's possible to relate to it and participate and see the consequence. I think this is really important, but it doesn't mean that the day that this is going to be or we want to scale it up to a level where it really challenges the powerful and those in the huge corporations and so on. I think we will reach completely different kind of challenges. So, so I think from my perspective, there's a lot to problematize and discuss here, and there is not the one solution to present. Yeah.
Well, in degrowth, there's at least an acknowledgement of historical responsibilities of particular areas of the world. So in the rich countries are of a particularly responsible for issues such as climate change, which also means, and that is something we emphasize very much, that going down with the matter and energy throughput here in the rich world would actually allow development spaces, including GDP growth, if you like, in the poorer world, with a midterm goal of having comparable living conditions across the world. That this is difficult to do is no question, but at least there's always this dimension there, and this is something I would recommend my friend here on the right is something to look not only at numbers but also at what I call political economy. That means the interests of people and the power resources they have, including in the rich countries. How likely is it that they will sign up for the kind of green solutions that you think about? What we see right now is rather policies towards America first, Norway first, Sweden first, or whatever you call it, Europe first. I called it in Malmö at the Degrowth conference. That means there is actually an awareness among the ruling people that our living standard can of course not be generalized to the rest of the world. This is just not possible. We have not even enough resources, and it wouldn't be a good idea to burn them all up either. So there is, if we think that a human being in the global south is worth the same as a Norwegian or a German, it cannot be in any different way than reducing the resources, the amount of resources that we do now, and other things than leading by example from where we are, and that includes at the same time reducing our footprints of consumption and production, but at the same time addressing the power inequalities that we have. That means we have to do something about the rich. We cannot afford the rich, as a prominent political economy title of the last years was called. That's why we are discussing eco-social policies such as not only minimum income that a lot of people discuss, but also maximum income, to directly basically decelerate the economic dynamic. How rich do you want to be in Norway? You are already among the richest countries of the world.
And
stinking, filthy rich.
I suppose that's also root of your skepticism to democracy then, in some sense. Preston, quickly.
Quickly. How do we then assure we're inside planetary boundaries? Well, it's difficult if we do not combine the best qualitative analysis with the best quantitative analysis. And we do now have Earth system science that is able to say something about the planetary boundaries in physical numbers terms. And then one way of distributing that fairly, so we know how much people can emit or how much they can use relative to the planetary boundaries, is to see it in the light of value creation. So in terms of value creation, GDP growth, for instance, if you have a huge GDP, you have more responsibility than if you have a low GDP. So that means people who, if you divide, for instance, the emissions per value added unit per year, that's your responsibility. So you're doing your fair share if you are performing better, using less fossil energy, less other resources like nitrogen, cutting down less forest while making more value added available for the population. And then the question is, what you just threw in, Maria, at the end there was, how do you institutionalize this in a global world?
How do you make it happen?
How do you make it happen? Yes. So first, I mean, if there was accept for instance, just banning maximum incomes, maybe it would be even easier to ban fossil fuel use, for instance, at a certain point. And we have done so in Norway when it comes to burning fossil fuels at home for heating.
Yeah. That's very good. That's good. No, I absolutely agree.
And then, of course, we are working for banning further oil and gas exploration. And the minute you ban further investments into oil, gas, fossil fuel infrastructure, at that time you will have accelerated the transition. So what are the power structures to make that happen or not happen? That's a huge debate, of course, but it's one way to institutionalize it. Why not make it simple? Just ban it.
Supply side measures then, which are difficult. Tone has a comment?
Yes, exactly, because you pointed a bit to it in your talk, Espen, that, I totally agree that we should ban certain things, but what about the rebound effect? So certain things, in this case, we're just switching to another energy source. And as I said, renewable energy also requires land, it requires materials, it requires energy even, and we cannot just pretend that we shouldn't reduce our energy use. So we need to not only switch to other more resource efficient energies when we have this well-known by now effect that the more we are efficient on resource productivity, we just use more resources. So we need to reduce our resource use as well, even if we have better technology.
Well, can I answer that?
2 seconds.
Okay. Well, the last is a complete error. If you have a 3% GDP growth and a 5% resource productivity growth, then resource use will by definition go down 2%. However, if resource productivity is lower than the rate of growth, then you will have an increase in the total resource use. So that depends on the distinction or the relation between GDP or value creation and the resource use used in that value creation. So that's a matter of defining. And then when it comes to rebound, that is a hugely discussed concept. But if you have that in all sectors, so if all sectors in the economy improve their resource productivity by 5%, then you eliminate rebound effect at the source.
Now we're going to open for questions. And Ebba, I know that Ebba always wants to ask a question, and she's got the microphone, so she will get to start. And then we'll do 3 and 3 questions. So it's you, and then we have Oscar, and in the front here. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question for Max. It's all very interesting, and it really makes you. We have to really rethink the system and how we organize our economy. But then I will have a question about your presentation, because I was trying to understand really what it is that you're trying to say. And when you talk about that we have to make a change in all systems in parallel. You talk about it's not going to be comfortable. You have a few years left for significant changes. There's no democratic example where such a change could be able to do as fast. Yeah, is it? And then when you come to the solutions, you didn't have that much time. You had to go really quickly past it. But I saw, you had to move away from exchange value, and there was a lot of, and I don't know if I understood it correctly, but more like a state-controlled economy. When I was looking at your slides, I sort of imagined like a green communism. Is what the idea I got. So I was sort of wondering, was that that's me trying to sum up? Is that what you're trying to say?
Shall I answer now or later?
We can do Oscar, and then we'll do, yeah.
Thank you. Espen, my question, which I'll you equalize degrowth and recession, but you know it's not true. It's not the same thing. Mm-hmm. And you also say that degrowth will mean less jobs and less investment. What if we keep GDP at the same level? I know that's not degrowth, but then you could still reallocate investments to green technologies. So why do you set up this straw man? That's my first question.
Why was that?
Why do you set up this straw man when you know it's not true? Second question. You start off by showing a lot of nice graphs that shows that there's a huge potential for increasing efficiency. But the reason why people, or at least some economists, have turned to degrowth is because we don't see any signs of this, of resource efficiency. Decoupling, we don't see it anywhere. So it looks nice that we can save 99, we could maybe go to circular economy, have 100% resource efficiency, but there's no signs of it. So should we maybe look for another direction? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question for Per. What do you do of the second law of thermodynamics?
Sorry,
second law of thermodynamics that says that you cannot recycle ad infinitum and so on. And I really liked your presentation. I thought it was very provocative, but my thought was like, okay, so in the Middle Age, people used to say God will do. And in the 21st century, people say technology will do. So we don't change anything, just the world. And my question is that you have a pure technological approach. And in particular, in the Max Core presentation, it was all about social structure and accumulation regime, mode of regulation. My question is, what do you say about all the social structure that were built upon those technologies? For instance, you say we could just ban fossil fuels. But there is 250 years of social structures that are built upon fossil fuels. And for instance, Max Kor's colleague Andreas Malm's book on fossil capital has shown that in a very clear manner. Also, Tim Mitchell, Carbon Democracy's book. So what do you do out of technology, essentially?
Okay, so there's a lot for Per Espen, so maybe you will start.
Okay. First, if you read my latest work together with Johan Rockström, who came up with the planetary boundaries concept, we can see there is empirical evidence for decoupling, particularly in the Nordic countries since 2000. So the reason why people tend to not find it is that they look in the previous century when the grey growth model was more strongly embedded. But the Nordic countries instituted a green growth strategy in 2000, 2001, and that was through the Nordic collaboration. And you can see gradually the effects. Unfortunately, not as much in Norway. We're still in the grey growth range, but both Sweden, Finland, and Denmark deliver more than 5% improvement on resource productivity as measured by carbon productivity since 2000. The same is the case also with Switzerland, and you can also look into the long-term lines or later rates of Costa Rica. But most excitingly is what happened in China in recent years. Because part of the reason why I'm always clubbed down when I speak about the carbon productivity of Sweden, Denmark, and Finland is that they are just exported their dirty industry to China, which is partly wrong, partly right, but I can't do that shortly, why it is so. But the main point is that China, since 2014, is now showing almost 5% improvement in the resource productivity. There is no country now, particularly as big in any nearby as China, who is currently realizing resource productivity improvements at this rate. When it comes to degrowth and in terms of GDP, maybe post-growth is better, but each time I say degrowth to anybody in my networks, they think recession. So this is part of the communication issue. How do we frame this issue so we don't get that backlash in terms of each time you say degrowth, people hear recession. Most people will, and if you are able to communicate it better, then...
But you used it in the same way.
Yeah, of course, but I asked, I invited you, I invited you to come up with a range, but you didn't. So... in
your presentation, you already used it in that way.
Sure, but that is why, that is why degrowth as such, is a dead horse communication-wise. So please find better words, and I'd love to join you. Then the second law of thermodynamics, that's also another, what you call it, of course, that's a physics thing. Now, people have this illusion, as you pointed out, that technology is the savior. And I think it's very religious. I have a background in archetypal psychology and religion, mythology, these kind of things. And yes, people do project the savior illusion on technology. I don't do so, because technology is always embedded, as you pointed out, in socioeconomic structures. And it's the use of the technology within, as it is embedded in those socioeconomic structures, that determines whether it will increase resource productivity in a good way or not. That is why the interface of market regulations and metrics combined with company performance is critical. And that is why I also teach green growth strategies to how have companies to deliver their fair share on the Paris Agreement. And I have managed to help, I wouldn't say, turn around, but there is a 20 billion NOK revenue company in Norway, 20 billion NOK a year, which has now turned around to those kind of metrics. So this is a way that helps companies see how they can do their fair share if they want to. Okay.
Great. Max, on your question?
Yeah, let me just reiterate that we are in an existential crisis. When it comes to climate change, as these days is very, very professionally and in much more popular terms than I could do it by a Swedish schoolgirl. Yeah. And which is absolutely consonant with Johan Rockström and colleagues who say we have about 12 years to make significant changes. Now, we have had about 20 years of green growth, 30 years. How long is it gone since the OECD originally launched this? I think it's at least 20 years. We see maybe absolute decoupling in a few countries for a few years, but here we really have to consider the outsourcing, and then we have to see, and we also have to consider the footprint of consumption, not only of production, and this is going up in Sweden, at least at the moment. So a flight to Thailand seems to count as a kind of human rights for many people. And now I'm coming to the state, and given the fact that we have such a short term in which to initiate crucial changes, and I say that to many of the people in degrowth, where some kind of anarchist ideas are quite popular, we won't have the time for the state to wither away either. This is not so much a problem here at that panel, but maybe with some other people. So I have started to look up critical state theories such as Bourdieu, Gramsci, and Poulantzas, and Poulantzas especially emphasizes that state power is a kind of condensation of social struggles that are going on also outside of the state. So any kind of state action in the right direction remains dependent on bottom-up mobilization from society, where the degrowth movement could play an important role. And I'm very happy that I can clarify that I am not for a green communism. The state is only one of many actors that will be needed to activate it, and the civil society is among them. And there are a lot of experience that are going on at the local level at the moment, where people come together and try to voluntarily reduce their carbon footprint, among other things. So I am not a statist.
Thank you. Quick comment to Tone. Okay, then we have two girls in the back, one in the right corner, and then there's a pink shirt. They've been waiting for a while. I have you.
Yeah. Hi, I have a question for Per Espen, and because I'm really happy that someone mentioned wastefulness, and then you said that nobody likes wastefulness, and that might be true, but there are some people who do not care. And you also were the first one that I heard today that mentioned taxes. Well, I missed the first section because I was out drinking with my friends last night, but now I'm happy that I did that because I was drinking with my immigrant, well-educated friends who are working construction. And they told me about them building a villa in Big Day. When this really rich Norwegian decided to tear down 4 villas and build just one big-ass villa that he just built as a conference center so that he can put it in the cost in his company. So he built it basically for free, and then he could do whatever he wanted. And he built a big glass corridor. So they bought the glass and they imported it from Sweden, and then the wind came and all the glass broke. 400,000 kroner. Who cares? They just brought another one.
Can I ask you to do the question?
So this is my question is, we cannot, can you just comment on this story of this parallel of the broken glass and the rich that don't have to care about the wastefulness?
And then Pink. Yeah.
No, I disagree with Max on the change from cars to horses took about 10 years. Observation from Ford.
I didn't get that, I'm sorry. Could you repeat? Sorry.
Omleggingen fra hester til biler tok omtrent 10 år, så vi har hatt endringer som tilsvarer de endringene vi må gjøre nå de neste 10 årene. Okay, engelsk? Okay.
Thanks.
All right. The changes from horsepower to cars, tractors and trains took about 10 years, and that's an observation from the industry magnate, Mr. Ford. So we have had changes before. So I disagree on your point that we haven't had big changes before. We have, indeed.
Thank you. Okay, there's another question in the back there, and then we will take 2 questions in the front.
Yeah, I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on a pre-scheduled deflationary currency for reducing frivolous or conspicuous consumption, or rather conspicuous waste.
Okay, we can...
What kind of currency? I didn't hear.
Conspicuous consumption.
Sure, but the currency.
Stationary currencies. Directed at anyone in particular?
No.
If they... Anyone.
Okay.
Yeah. Would you like to start?
Yes.
Yeah.
So when it comes to consumption in general in our society, I think we should still step up the efforts of increasing taxes on resource use as much as possible, and that would include those kind of building materials that you mentioned, and that should be offset by a progressive tax so that for poorer people their income tax is less. This would be revenue neutral, and it's a model that has been proposed quite a few times, but it still hasn't been utilized to its full potential. So rather, as here in Norway, it's actually going the other way around, with taxing resources less and poorer people more. So turning that system around would address structurally the issue that you brought up. Suddenly wastefulness becomes more economically visible, and the available technological solutions would then get more attractive. Just to sum up, also one comment in terms of energy use and renewables. It's quite easy to supply the world with renewable energy fully. You only need about 1% of Sahara Desert with solar panels. That actually provides all the energy you need. And in this case, when you put solar panels on your roof, for instance, it's clean. And it's so clean, it also brings primary energy consumption down by 1/3 by itself, because usually 66 to 80% of that fossil fuel is just waste anyway. So electrification is a huge way forward, and that brings up your issue with shift from the horses to the cars. I think the speed of electrification over the next 12 years is key. Thanks.
Thank you. And then, Max, would you like to comment on
that? I do not question the horse car transition, whether it was in 10 years or no. Okay. And I'm also I am of course also in favor of using more renewable energies. There's no question. But on the other hand, using less overall energy always helps. And this is something we should also have in mind, because if we use current technologies, building a solar panel takes a lot of resources. Some of them are very rare, and a lot of people die these days, basically in the corresponding struggles. So. Maybe we can agree on that maybe a combination of using less energy overall and providing the energy we need as renewable as possible, maybe a nice consensus at the end.
Great. So I have promised a few more questions, and we'll have to keep them very short, and I'm very sorry about taking time of your break. We can't do any more, but we will have here a question. And the girl behind.
Thanks. It's a follow-up question.
And if you would like to go for a break, obviously, please do that.
It's a follow-up question to Per Espen Stoknes, because you said in your concluding remarks that point two, that countries like Sweden, Denmark, Costa Rica, and others are already achieving green growth. But sure, I mean, this is surely not the case. I mean, in response to the earlier question, you referred us to a piece you wrote with Johan Rockström. Well, I've read that piece, and that demonstrates, yes, Sweden and a few other Nordic countries have achieved impressive improvements in carbon productivity, but it's far, far less convincing than it's not sufficient basis to say that these countries are achieving green growth. That's surely not the case.
Yes, I have two challenges to the whole panel. The first is I hope that you're not usually talking this much about growth, that is just here because that's the topic here, because it seems like you all don't want people to keep talking about growth and being so concerned about that, so I hope you will quit doing that. And the second is the Greta Thunberg challenge, which is that I think you should really think about how you could also be complicating the debate and how you're talking about these bottom-up approaches in a very top academic bubble that maybe isn't contributing as much as you want to, and also that you are complicating the solution, which is just that we have to stop using fossil fuels and killing species. So, yes.
I would definitely like to support the last comment, and I'm trying very much to learn from Greta Thunberg. And the reason I do talk about growth in other times as well, because our whole political system, as we've discussed today, is based on this. So if you want to challenge the current political power, you need to engage in what they're talking about. The EU strategy is based on smart, inclusive, whatever growth. It's all growth. I mean, we cannot not engage in the public debates either. And this is also to come back to the degrowth movement, which is not a movement about recession, but about questioning the obsession with growth. And okay, so then it's framed in degrowth terms to try to challenge it. But of course, we also should talk about the positive alternatives. I mean, this is clearly, the two has to go hand in hand, but I don't think we can look away from the ongoing political debates and ignore them either. And just to mention, tomorrow, if any of you are more interested in discussing about degrowth as a movement, not this recession degrowth, then we are doing a degrowth walk from Frognerseteren at 11 o'clock.
Maybe you say when we meet. Oh, you said that, sorry.
So a brief comment then in terms of the piece you mentioned. this is really quite a bit of an accounting issue when it comes to responsibility. And as you all know, probably, Greenhouse Gas Protocol sets up Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 to see what kind of emissions you're primarily responsible for, secondarily responsible for, and responsible for in the third degree. So when we are talking about carbon productivity, we are talking about improvements in those emissions over which you have direct control. So it's primarily a Scope 1 carbon productivity issue. The problem with including, let's say, Chinese emissions in your own consumption becomes one very technically demanding one of double counting for the same emissions. How do you divide the responsibility for the emissions that come from Chinese production, where they also contribute to raising average incomes and employment among the Chinese? So there are social benefits, there is work, and there is opportunity for trade. Of course, we could say we don't want to trade because you have dirty, polluting power in your workplaces, but I'm not sure if that helps the world as a whole. So then the issue becomes, how do you split the responsibility for Scope 3 emissions in a fair way? And to make this very clear and direct and universally applicable, we mean it's correct to be primarily using Scope 1 in these emissions. Of course, this is a debate that will go on. We cannot say we do not have responsibility for Scope 2 or Scope 3, but we should at least primarily be speaking about Scope 1, because otherwise we're into very deep accounting difficulties.
Max?
I just want to say one thing about growth. Again, I'm sorry. It's like maybe it makes sense to think about, as we say in degrowth, so now decolonize our imaginaries from because there are a lot of mainstream political economists who are not too optimistic about growth rates for Western countries. Robert Gordon, for example. So it actually makes sense from several viewpoints to think about an economy that doesn't grow either very quickly or not at all. So if you like it or not, it might be an issue that doesn't go away. And if you, we had growth in the panel. That's why I wasn't talking about it, but I can refer you to my normal work, where I'm very much write a lot about welfare, about human needs, and there we have made also some studies saying we are likely to be able to provide the satisfaction of basic human needs for all people now and in the future, but we are definitely not able to satisfy all wants that people have, including in the rich world. This is just not possible. And so looking at needs satisfiers, and we have one prominent representative of this kind of work here in the room, who applied Max Neef's approach to that, very two different contexts. I'm talking of Monica Guillen-Royo here. So this is definitely something we need to look into. Basically, how can we understand well-being in other terms than with GDP growth? And then I'm very happy to stop talking about growth.
On that note, I want to thank you all for spending 2 hours on a Saturday discussing growth. And please thank our panelists. They will have some chocolate gifts. And now there's a very short break before the next session begins.